Okay, well, today I'd like to talk to you about what's essentially one half of the research that I've been doing over the last few years. And this kind of research started with two questions. The two of the biggest challenges for global conservation are firstly a lack of knowledge that we have about global biodiversity, and secondly a lack of resources. How can we sustain the number of protected areas we currently have? How can we sustain the number of protected areas that we want to have in the future? So I've been dealing with two issues. How do we fill the knowledge gaps in conservation, and how do we develop ways in which to finance and show the value of conservation to societies? And today I want to talk to you about, generally speaking, about shortfalls in knowledge of global biodiversity. So a few years ago, I got together with Joachim Hortal from Madrid University, and we put together a group of people to do a workshop in what are the big shortfalls in knowledge of global biodiversity. And the upshot of this was we came up with 7 different sorts of shortfalls that we gave names of famous scientists from the past. So perhaps the best known shortfalls are the Linnaean shortfalls, which is our lack of knowledge about the number of species on Earth, and the Wallacean shortfall, or you could think of this as the biogeographic shortfall, is even when we know what the species is, often we have incomplete knowledge about the distribution of the species. But we also have incomplete knowledge about population dynamics, about evolution, about functional traits and ecological functions, about abiotic tolerances, abiotic niches, and about biotic niches, ecological interactions. So we published this review in annual reviews of ecology, evolution, and systematics in 2015. And as you often do with these sort of papers, about a year afterwards, I was rereading the paper and, oh my God, I've made a huge mistake here. And it's a mistake that ecologists especially, and conservationists, have been making since there's been ecology and conservation, which is we came up with a beautiful classification of knowledge shortfalls, and we forgot to include ourselves, human beings, within the shortfalls. So when we were talking about ecological interactions, we weren't thinking at all about interactions between the natural world and humans. We were just thinking about ecological interactions between wild species. So I think there's probably an 8th shortfall. This is the lack of knowledge about human nature relations. And of course, this is vitally important for a number of reasons. We don't have knowledge, for example, about what animals are eaten, what animals are hunted, what animals are used as pets, what animals people are interested in. So we have huge deficits in our knowledge in terms of the global distribution, the spatial and temporal distribution of interactions between humans and the natural world. Now, this is important for a number of reasons. Perhaps most fundamentally, interactions with nature have been shown over the last 20 or 30 years to be incredibly important for human well-being. Kevin Gaston, a professor in the UK, talks about the extinction of experience, which is that children nowadays are having far, far less interactions with nature than they did 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And of course, from an applied perspective, a lot of the world still depends upon the exploitation of nature for food security, for economic security. And exploitation of nature plays a huge role in conservation as well. Another factor is interest in nature is essential because conservation depends on public support. Without public support, conservation won't work. Protected areas won't be supported. And also it's vitally important for fundraising. which I've already mentioned, we have a huge hole in resources for conservation. Human interactions with nature also can be used to generate data to fill the other shortfalls. This is something I'm going to be talking about today. And very topically, and I just put a little bit of this in at the last moment, interactions with nature, of course, are the causes of zoonosis, such as the coronavirus. If we had had more information about interactions with nature, maybe we could have prevented the current pandemic. Let me explain that a bit more. So, for instance, if we knew much more about interactions with high-risk zoonosis hosts, such as bats, rodents, monkeys, birds, such as things like where are they caught, who catches them, how are they handled, what's the supply chain, how are they transported, how are they kept with other animals, who sells them, how much do they cost, who buys them, what do they do with them? If we had detailed information on this, then we could develop policy to create a much safer world. How can we prevent future pandemics if we don't even have this type of information? And maybe it might surprise you, but at the moment, we still have no idea, or sorry, we have some idea. We have very little idea what is bought and sold in the markets, in the wildlife markets of Southeast Asia. I recently, I've just submitted a paper on this, where we're looking at the knowledge shortfalls in natural areas, farms and markets, and urban areas that we would need to fill, and the strategies that we would need in order to make the world a safer place. And this is about conservation. This is not public health and medicine. This is about conservation strategies and how conservation strategies can align with public health to make the world a safer place. So that's currently in review. Let's see what happens to that. So how can we get this sort of data on human-wildlife interactions, on how can we fill these huge shortfalls of information about the distribution of species in time or space, for example? Well, human-nature interaction data is difficult and expensive to generate. In the early 2000s, I worked in Indonesia with my colleague from Oxford University, Paul Jepson, and we did perhaps the biggest ever household survey in the history of conservation science. We visited, not personally, I have to say, we had large teams of people. We visited 2,000 households in the 6 largest cities of Java and Bali to ask an hour-long questionnaire about their interactions with wildlife. Especially we were interested in songbirds, because over half of all households within urban Indonesia own a bird, which was kind of one of the amazing statistics that came out of it. But the thing that really stuck in my mind is it's really, really hard work. If you want to get data on human-nature interactions by asking people, it's always going to be small scale. You know, I might think that 2,000 households is a lot, but this, of course, it's just a tiny proportion. So, you know, you've got this huge scale problem. We want this information, but it's really difficult to get, and it's very costly. You can get very high quality information, but it's very, very difficult. So is there another way? And this is what I began to think about 10 years ago. Again, with my colleague Paul Jepson, we were really thinking about this. How can we get this sort of information? Are there other sources of information? And we started to think, well, if the internet broadly mirrors the real world, can we use digital content to monitor nature and to monitor our interactions with nature? And of course, there is a huge amount of information out there, but it is really messy. It's not systematic. It occurs in all sorts of places on all sorts of different platforms. And how on earth can you make a sense of all of this massive data? Well, this is what we've been trying to do for the last 5 years. And the rest of this talk is based on two big reviews or perspectives of this issue. And it involves two new subdisciplines that are very closely related. The first one is conservation culturonomics, which is the name I came up with for using big data to study human-nature interactions. And I should just mention a few people who have been very important in that. That's me at the top. This is my colleague Paul Jepson, who I worked with in Indonesia. This is Anna Maljado, who's done a lot of fantastic work recently on knowledge mapping, biodiversity knowledge mapping, and conservation action mapping in the Amazon. And this is my postdoc at the bottom, Ricardo Correa, who is now working over in Helsinki for Henrique de Menin, over on the right-hand side, who's the head of the conservation geography group there. And Ivan Jaric, who led the iEcology paper, was working on similar things and got together with us to say, hey, I think we can use these sort of techniques also to get data on ecological data on species, not about human nature interactions, but data on the species and the ecology itself. And Uri Grol at the bottom also independently started working, especially using Wikipedia to get information on public interest at very, very high scales. So these are the kind of core group of people who are involved in this area at the moment. So what are conservation culturonomics and iEcology? Well, the term culturonomics was coined in a paper in Science in 2011 by Mitchell et al. And they said that culturonomics is the quantification of human culture through the analysis of vast digital corpora. So a digital corpora is basically anything that is digitized. Could be YouTube videos, could be websites, could be Facebook pages. Anything that's on the internet can be a digital corpora. And you can use culturonomic tools to go in and extract information from these digital corpora. Conservation culturonomics is the application of these methods to human nature interactions. iEcology, on the other hand, is the capture and analysis of digital data generated for diverse purposes. So data that's not necessarily generated for the purpose of collecting ecological data, but we can use it to study ecological patterns and processes. So let me start with conservation culturonomics. So we thought there were at least 5 areas that you could use conservation culturonomics. You could find new conservation orientated constituencies and show public interest in nature, identify conservation emblems, provide new metrics to support conservation decision making, assess the cultural impact of conservation interventions, and you can use it to frame conservation issues and promote public understanding. So what sort of things can we get data on and measure? Well, we can get data on non-human species. We can get data on places such as protected areas. We can get data on interactions between humans and species or humans and places. And we can get data on things like research effort. So here's my first illustration, a very simple illustration of conservation culturonomics, where this is data from, this is Google search volume here, and this is people searching for the term tatu bola, which is Portuguese for the Brazilian three-banded armadillo. And you can see we have a spike here and a spike here, which is just when the mascot for the World Cup in Brazil was announced, and here is when the World Cup took place. So you can see there was a huge spike in public interest around the time of these two events. what are we measuring? What do you actually measure? What are the metrics of culturonomics? Well, I think there are three major types of metrics. There's salience, which is the volume of digital representations. So this could be the number of websites that mention a particular species, for example. There's interest. This could be the number of page views on Wikipedia or the number of views of a YouTube video. And there's sentiment, which is actually going in and finding out what people feel about a place or a species or a concept or an organization. And there are various ways to get that. You can use sentiment analysis, doing an analysis of text, or you can use a very simple metric such as likes or number of stars on TripAdvisor or some such thing. Here's another simple example of culturonomics. These are 5 extinct bird species. This is the number of times that they are mentioned in books from the Google Books archive. And the interesting thing here is you can often see interest in the species peaking after they have gone extinct, somewhat ironically. So let me take you through quickly a simple example. Let's try to, let's think about measuring the salience of species on the global internet. So this could be, we could measure the salience of species, the volume of representations, by how many websites mention a particular species. So how might we go about that? Well, we immediately hit a challenge here. Lots of languages in the world, a single species can have more than one common name. And some species have common names that mean something totally different. If we take this small, rather attractive duck here, the teal, it is also the name of a color of paint, named after the duck, of course. But if we were to search for the word teal on the internet, the majority of websites that we would return on those searches would be about paint, not about birds. So what's the solution to that? I mean, it means that the data would be maybe too messy to do anything with. And how can you do a global analysis if the teal has a different name in each language? It would be really, really difficult to do a search for the common name of every species in every language if you wanted to do a big macro scale study. So we set upon the idea, well maybe, because nobody speaks Latin anymore, maybe we can use Latin names of a proxy of common names. If there's a strong correlation between the salience, the internet salience of Latin names and common names, then we can use Latin names and we won't have this problem of multiple meanings. So we did this. We did this for English common names against English Latin names using the whole of the internet and every extant bird species. And we found that there was indeed a very strong correlation with a few outliers, but generally nearly all species adhered to this relationship. Now, of course, that's great for English, but does it hold for other cultures, other countries? We tested this in a paper we published in Ecological Indicators. And as hopefully you can see here, we tested it in 6 very different countries, and we found a strong relationship in all countries. The only slight outlier here appears to be Spain, where the relationship seems a bit steeper than in the other countries. And we were a bit worried about this. And then we realized that, again, we'd made a bit of a mistake here, which is that we only studied common names, vernacular names in Castilian. We ignored common names in Catalan, in Basque, in Galician. And if you add in those common name languages, then the slope reverts to the slope that you get in for all of the other countries. So good. Looks like we can use Latin names as a metric of web salience for species. So now the next stage that we published last year in People and Nature journal was, what drives the differences in internet salience between species? Why are some species culturally very salient, whereas other species are hardly known at all? Well, when we analysed this, we found that the patterns were really quite strong and, in a sense, exactly what you might expect. So for example, one of the strongest relationships was the number of years known to science of species. And what you found is that the first species to be described are also species with the highest representation on the internet. And I think this tells us a little bit about the early taxonomists, that they described the things that they were most familiar with, the commonest things, which are also many of which are common today. And they got sent interesting animals from all over the world. So often they described animals from lots of places, even though they were mainly based in Europe, they described many animals from all over the world, most of which are very common or striking and well known. We also found, as you might expect, strong relationships with human use. Caged domestic birds have very high cultural profile. Game species, urban species. So this is the relationship with biogeography. Species that people see every day because the majority of people live in urban spaces have a very high representation on the internet. And also, interestingly, species with an increasing population trend, which often tend to be species that can live within urban settings. And finally, we tried to correct for the fact that some countries don't have a lot of people on the internet. Other countries have a lot of very high internet penetrance. So what we did is we created an index based upon the biogeography of species. So a species with 100% web capacity is one of these species that lives in, that you can find in almost any country in the world. So things like the feral pigeon would be an example of that. So what we did is we created an index for web capacity for the countries within which the species occurred. And species, that means that a species occurring only in a country like Papua New Guinea with very low proportion of global web users will have a very low web capacity index. And that was also very significant, showing that the geographies of the internet play an important role in the distribution of digital representation. So how does this relate to real conservation? How can we use this sort of information? Well, this is a work in progress at the moment. The top map shows the global distribution of endangered bird species. And the bottom map shows the distribution of endangered bird species that are also highly culturally salient. So these are the very well-known endangered bird species. And you can see the map is actually quite different. It's quite interesting. We have a hot spot here in the African Rift Valley, going down here across into the Namib Desert over there. So it's interesting because these cultural hotspots for globally endangered species aren't necessarily in places where you would expect, such as the US or Europe. They're actually in places that have a high proportion of globally endangered species that are also very, very well known globally. And of course, this means that there's considerable potential for generating funds for conservation action within these places. So that's currently in preparation. Continuing our theme of coronavirus, there are some really interesting temporal patterns that you can see as well. So here are 5 very common bird species in Europe. And these columns are data for France, Germany, and United Kingdom. And the axis down here are the first 30 weeks of the year. The blue line is the relative number of Google searches for these species from 2016 to 2019. The red line is the relative number of Google searches for these species in 2020. And the black line coming down the middle is when the lockdown started in these countries. So you can see there was a huge and immediate effect of increased interest in garden birds when people were stuck at home. Really interesting, of course, because it suggests that there's a giant conservation constituency out there that simply do not have the time normally to study, to get interested, to interact with the nature around their houses. This is currently in review, Frontiers of Ecology and Environment, hoping to hear about that very soon. Perhaps the biggest issue with relation to public interest is probably with respect to protected areas, because protected areas, as you probably know, around the world are under considerable threat because politicians, especially those from the right and the left actually, tend to view protected areas as an opportunity cost, whereas the idea being that if they develop the protected areas for mining, for agriculture, for other things, then they'd be much more valuable for society than just leaving them as protected areas. And this leads to protected area downsizing, downgrading, degazettement, or PAD. So public sentiment is really important here, because if a protected area is really well known, then if it's threatened by development, there's much more likely to be pushback from society, campaigns against development that will protect the protected area. So you can think of it as a matrix where we have developmental threat down here and societal interest concern here. So protected areas that have very high societal interest and low development threat aren't very vulnerable at all to PAD. But those that have low public interest, which are not very well known and people don't show a lot of interest or positive sentiment towards, but have high developmental threat levels, are very vulnerable to PAD. And this translates into policy in the following way. If we can identify protected areas in each of these categories, we'll know whether we need actions to increase public interest for those with low threat and low public interest, actions to reduce threats and increase public interest for the highly vulnerable protected areas, and for protected areas with high interest and high developmental threat, we need to think about how we can reduce the threats and resolve conflicts. So we can, by classifying protected areas in terms of public interest and developmental threats, we can identify the sort of conservation action that we need. And this is what one of my PhD students has been doing, Jonathan Dos Santos in Alagoas. So he's been using Wikipedia page views as an index of public interest. And and of course, because the majority of Portuguese speakers are in Brazil, this means that most views of Portuguese versions of Wikipedia are from Brazilians. So that way we're able to split between national interest, Portuguese page views, and global interest, which is all the other page views. And he took threat indices from the DOPA database. So looking at, for example, how much agriculture is within the buffer zone, how much agriculture within protected areas, how much road infrastructure is being brought up. And using this, we were able to identify which protected areas were most threatened and most vulnerable to PAD if they were threatened. And we're currently preparing that now. He's just finishing his doctorate at the moment. Hopping quickly to iEcology. If you remember, iEcology is getting information about ecology, not human nature interactions, but simply the ecology. So for instance, distribution or population dynamics of species, using information that people leave on the internet, often for other purposes. So we can potentially use iEcology to explore species occurrences, identify new or lost species. There was famously there was a plant species was rediscovered on Facebook a couple of years ago. We can look at trait dynamics, biogeographic patterns. We can explore biotic and abiotic interactions, so we can potentially fill some of those global shortfalls as well. We can look at feeding patterns, food web construction, and we can investigate ecosystem and habitat dynamics in response to anthropogenic impacts like climate change. Let me show you a couple of examples of this that we used from the paper. This is an example of using Wikipedia page views again. This is data for three migratory species. This is resident species, and this is for tropical species. And you can see that what's happening is, as these species are moving into an area, in this case the United States, is that you got a huge boost in interest. So people viewing these species was reflected in people looking up information about these species in Wikipedia. So you can track temporal changes in populations through temporal changes in public interest. Of course, this is quite an indirect way of doing it. This is one of my favorite studies. This was using Google Images. So Google Images are geolocated. And if you take a species with a hybrid zone, such as the hooded crow and the carrion crow, which has a hybrid zone which goes across Europe, this study took Google Images of these crows in order to identify where the hybrid zone was, using empirical data based on people posting images on Google Images. Really innovative and interesting use of Google Images to generate ecological data. Another one of my favorite examples, this is a bit more complicated. They used Google image data to create the network of interactions between birds and mammals in Africa. These are birds that are non-mutualistic, and these are mutualistic species such as oxpeckers. You've got two species of oxpecker in Africa, the red-billed and the yellow-billed oxpecker. So they were able to map ecological interactions over huge scales using data people had posted. Presumably, most of these people are posting their data from safaris and other types of ecotourism. And this data they processed in order to recreate ecological interactions over large geographical scales. Another example using a different platform, this is data from YouTube, and they recreated the behavioral patterns of two species of squirrel, the red squirrel, which is a native European species, and the gray squirrel, which is a North American species, which is an invasive species in Europe. And they were able to recreate the network of behavioral interactions in two different habitats, forest and urban environments, using data that they'd got from YouTube. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about all these amazing studies and showing you these interesting figures. But of course, I'm sure that a lot of you are there nodding to yourself thinking, yeah, but the internet's full of crap, isn't it? So how much can we trust this data? What are the limitations? Every paper that I've been involved in conservation, culturonomics and iEcology, we've taken pains to extensively talk about various limitations. I'm going to outline a few of the major ones now. First of all, if the internet is a mirror of the real world, then it's a fairground mirror where you look in the mirror and things are distorted. So you've always got to bear that in mind. One of these big distortions, of course, is internet geographies. The internet penetrance varies with country, with communities, and what you see isn't always a representative sample of the human population that you're looking at. Lots of people have talked to me at various lectures that I've given saying, yeah, but what about local communities, indigenous communities who aren't connected to the internet? And the answer to that is, well, this doesn't work for them. This data is simply a reflection of what content gets put on the internet and the people who put the content on there. Technical difficulties. A lot of companies don't share raw data. So we can get data on Google searches, but we can't get raw data on Google searches. We have to use their Google Trends platform. Incredibly powerful. Everyone uses Google, but it would be fantastic to have the actual numbers because then we could do much more sophisticated analysis. Data can be edited, deleted, moved, censored, or sometimes access can be removed with no warning. This happened. We were collecting Instagram photos from a giant marine protected area that we worked on in Brazil from Instagram, and they removed access to their API, so we could no longer study cultural ecosystem services that we were using the photos to study. And of course, most generally, the data are noisy, messy, unstructured, and often incomplete. This requires a different way of thinking. It's not standard science. It's not testing hypotheses most of the time. It's looking for patterns in big data. And if you're interested in getting involved in this sort of work, you need to read about the epistemology of big data analysis and how it differs from the standard model of science. And you need to really understand that in order to engage with the work, because what you're seeing isn't standard science. Okay, so what's going to happen in the future? Last slide to finish on 45 minutes. Well, first of all, we're seeing an explosion of the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, to identify and classify digital data. So, for example, we can, there are lots of studies that have been using photo databases to identify cultural ecosystem services. Here's one example from us, from this big marine protected area that I was telling you about. This is photos depicting landscape appreciation, an important cultural ecosystem service, in the Upper Costa de Corrais in Alagoas, 220 kilometers of fantastic coastal ecosystem where I used to live. We published this last year, but we had to analyze all of these photos, classify all these photos by manually. I've got a PhD student, Felipe Vieira, who is currently using artificial intelligence to classify different sorts of cultural ecosystem services. And he's managed to map cultural ecosystem services across the whole coast of Brazil. So it could potentially a very, very powerful technique. And we can also use this potentially to identify species, interactions among species, interactions between humans and species, and potentially to quantify sentiment. For example, you might be able to quantify the expressions on people's faces. Google have an algorithm that's quite good at doing this already. The future is also going to bring a huge expansion in internet coverage. So the tools and techniques we're developing now are just going to become better and more powerful in the future. And of course, we're still developing new tools and methods. My old postdoc, Ricardo Correa, is one of the world experts in this. He has a huge toolbox of R programs he's written specifically to do conservation, culturonomics, and iEcology tasks. And he's very, very happy to share them. He's a really nice guy. We have a special issue on conservation culturonomics coming out in conservation biology. Not sure when it's going to be coming out. Probably looks like January now. We were hoping to get it in before the end of the year. And this has a big paper we wrote on methods. And I'm hoping, my big dream is to one day have a global digital conservation observatory based on iEcology and conservation culturonomics, perhaps hosted by CIBIO, if I can persuade the European Union to fund such a thing, or somebody else. And it would be really good to start integrating this data with existing platforms, such as biodiversity information systems or the IUCN Red List. So all I've just got one thing left to say. Thanks to my collaborators, especially Ana Malhado, Ricardo Correa, and Paul Jepson, who are in from the start of this subject area. And so far, our work's been funded by the Brazilian National Council for Research, CNPq, FAPIAL, which is our local research council in Alagoas, and the British Council have also been very generous in funding our research. You may see a picture of me fishing there. This is my welcome seminar to CIBIO. If anybody's interested in fishing for bass, please get in touch with me. I'd love to find out about it here. I'm a fanatic angler. I'm also a really keen guitarist stroke singer. So if anybody's interested in rock music, also please feel free to contact me. In addition, of course, to the research. So you can contact me directly at richardjamesladle@gmail.com. Please follow my Twitter if you're interested in what's happening in Bio and other projects. And my lab website, the Laboratory of Conservation of the 21st Century, has got a website, an Instagram account, a YouTube account, and a Facebook account. We're really, really keen on dissemination of conservation science, especially to younger people and kids. If you're interested in that, please take a look at it. Ana Malhado has been taking a major role in that recently. She's my wife and she's here as well. So if you're interested in scientific communication, please get in touch with me. I'd love to put you in touch with her and we can take it from there. So to finish off, thank you very much. I'm really, really happy to be here. Hope you've enjoyed this seminar, and I'd like to give another seminar talking about how we can finance conservation in the future at some time.